Are you ready for one of the most dramatic and heart-stopping rescues you've ever heard? Picture a horse left to perish in the middle of the desert, bones protruding, insects swarming, and no one daring to lift a finger to help. In a twist of fate, a determined horse rescuer arrives, risking life and limb in a raging sandstorm to save the day. This gripping moment marks just the beginning of a tale filled with high-stakes danger, powerful adversaries, and the unbreakable bond between a man and a horse. If you want to find out how their harrowing journey plays out and how a single act of compassion can stand against wealth and power, stick with us to the very end. Remember to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you never miss an update. Your support helps us bring you more incredible stories of courage, survival, and hope. The desert was an endless ocean of cracked earth and swirling heat, a place where life seemed determined to prove it could endure the harshest conditions. The sun hung high, hammering down without mercy on anything that dared to remain in its path. In the midst of this scorched wasteland, a solitary figure stood unmoving, a thoroughbred horse, or what little remained of one. Its ribs protruded under tattered skin, and a swarm of buzzing insects clouded around open wounds that refused to close. The horse's once proud muscles had wasted away, leaving only a skeletal frame that trembled with each shaky breath. The wind carried a foul mixture of sweat, dried blood, and rot, a smell that forced most travelers to shudder and look away. Even the bravest souls hurried past, unwilling to confront the horror head-on. Locals in the nearest settlement whispered about this horse for days, passing rumors from one household to the next. Some said the animal had been cursed. Others claimed it was beyond all help. A few dared to snap pictures from a distance, capturing images that would haunt them for weeks. But not a single person found the resolve to step forward. Whether it was fear of the horse's condition or dread of the cost and commitment involved in caring for a dying creature, no one had stopped. Drivers rattling along the dusty road in their battered vehicles, slowed to gawk but sped away before the desert's brutal sun could force them to dwell on their conscience. In the sweltering haze, the horse's dull eyes hardly blinked. Occasionally, its tail gave a half-hearted flick to ward off the relentless flies, but those tiny pests seemed determined to devour every last scrap of life the creature had left. The thoroughbred appeared mere hours from its final breath, the intense heat sapping whatever thread of energy remained. Yet fate had a different plan in store, one that would hinge entirely on a single decision made by a man who had promised himself he would never again become entangled in the plight of a damaged animal. That man was Daniel Carter, a former horse breeder who'd once dedicated decades to rehabilitating and rehoming abused thoroughbreds. His reputation among horse enthusiasts had been extraordinary. He was known for his gentleness, his relentless determination, and the miracles he performed for creatures everyone else deemed lost. But heartbreak had visited him in the worst way imaginable. 2 years prior, his most cherished stallion, the horse that had revived his own spirit during some of his darkest times, had died tragically from an aggressive illness. Crushed by grief, Daniel had closed his ranch to new rescues, vowing never again to invest his heart in a lost cause. Yet on this day, as Daniel rumbled along the dusty road in his old pickup truck, the sight of that skeletal horse stopped him cold. Despite every oath he'd sworn to avoid this pain, a familiar ache tugged at his chest. Perhaps it was the way the thoroughbred's eyes gazed at him. Silent, uncomplaining, but clearly pleading for someone to take notice. Or maybe it was just that Daniel, deep down, had never truly abandoned his calling to save those who had no other hope. Daniel parked his battered, rust-stained truck a short distance from the horse. The moment he cut the engine, the silence of the desert rushed in, swallowing every trace of mechanical noise and forcing him to confront his own heartbeat. His throat felt dry, and a sour taste climbed the back of his tongue as he stepped onto the powdery sand. The hot wind raked across his face, instantly stinging his eyes. Overhead, vultures circled, tracing lazy arcs in the sky as if waiting for nature's inevitable conclusion. He took a few cautious steps closer, and the horse twitched its ears in response, but didn't shy away. Daniel saw the creature's side expand and contract in a ragged rhythm, proof that, despite everything, it still clung to life. A swarm of flies scattered at his approach, then regrouped the instant he paused. For a moment, Daniel thought of heading back to the truck. thought of simply driving away. He told himself he was done putting his heart on the line, but his feet refused to move in retreat. Something deeper pulled him forward, an old sense of responsibility, or an echo of the love he once had for these noble animals. He rummaged in the bed of his truck and found a plastic water bottle. After unscrewing the cap, he cautiously extended his arm, letting a thin trickle of water splash onto the sand near the horse's mouth. At first, there was no reaction. The horse's cracked lips barely moved, and for a terrifying heartbeat, Daniel was sure he'd come too late. Then, in a moment so fragile it felt almost sacred, the horse's muzzle quivered. Its tongue darted out, trying to catch the droplets. Hope flared in Daniel's chest. Approaching carefully, he let more water spill in front of the animal, hoping not to startle it. This time, the horse stretched its neck and managed to lick a small puddle, swallowing as though every drop was pure salvation. Daniel blinked, forcing down a lump in his throat that threatened to derail his composure. In that moment, his old instincts kicked in. He could already hear the warnings in his head. This will cost you money, time, heartbreak. The cynic in him whispered that it might already be too late. But another part of him, a part that once fueled his entire life, urged him to refuse to let the animal die alone in the desert. Driven by that instinct, Daniel hurried to the truck to retrieve a makeshift rope halter from his emergency kit. He looped it gently around the horse's head, murmuring soft assurances under his breath. At first, the thoroughbred tried to shy away, but its exhaustion was too profound. It seemed to yield from sheer inability to do otherwise. Carefully, Daniel attempted to coax it to walk, but the creature's legs buckled, trembling as if each step threatened to drain its last reserves of strength. Daniel caught the horse's weight as best he could, supporting it until it steadied, then managed to nudge it a few steps forward. Despite the minor progress, Daniel could feel time closing in on him like an encroaching storm. The horizon itself mirrored that fear. Far off, a haze was gathering in the sky, darkening at the edges as the wind shifted. A sandstorm was building, and soon the desert would be a whirling fury of grit and gusts. Getting caught in a sandstorm was brutal under normal circumstances. For a horse as weak as this one, it would be almost certain death. Realizing the urgency, Daniel acted swiftly. He grabbed a worn tarp from the back of his truck, one he typically used to shield cargo from desert dust. It was tattered and frayed at the corners, but it would have to do. He draped it gently over the horse's back, then secured it with a spare rope, creating a flimsy shield. Already the wind was intensifying, but skittering across the ground in restless waves. The horse stood unsteadily under Daniel's watchful eye. Every now and then, it shifted its weight from one leg to the other, as if mere standing was an ordeal. Determined not to leave the creature to face the storm alone, Daniel decided to stay by its side. He led the horse to a slight depression in the land, where a cluster of rocks offered minimal shelter from the gathering winds. There, he pressed himself against the horse's flank, hoping his body would serve as an additional barrier against the howling desert. The first gusts arrived like a warning, whipping the tarp and spraying a fine layer of sand against Daniel's exposed skin. It stung, but he gritted his teeth. The thoroughbred snorted in alarm, eyes rolling back in confusion at the sudden violence of the weather. Daniel stroked the horse's neck, murmuring reassuring nonsense, words that meant nothing except to convey that it was not alone. The storm escalated quickly, turning the world into a haze of swirling grit. Every breath felt like swallowing shards of glass. Daniel squinted, pulling his hat down to protect his face. In that chaotic swirl, time lost meaning. Minutes, hours, it all blended into a single, relentless assault of wind and grit. Daniel closed his eyes intermittently to shield them, but he refused to loosen his grip on the rope that bound him to the horse. He wondered if he was risking his own life for an impossible cause. But each time doubt crept in, he recalled the horse's desperate attempt to drink that single mouthful of water. Something in that gesture had told him the creature still had the will to survive. When the sandstorm finally passed, the pre-dawn sky glowed a muted gray, casting a ghostly light over the ravaged desert. Daniel and the horse stood caked in dust, every inch of them coated in a gritty film. Yet they were both alive. As the wind subsided, Daniel cautiously led the horse a few yards back to his truck. Tonight's ordeal had been only the beginning, and he suspected the real battle had yet to start. Gently, Daniel guided the horse to a position where he could attempt to coax it into the trailer. The battered metal enclosure was outfitted for short transports, originally meant for taking healthy horses to local events or for routine veterinary visits. Trying to haul a horse this week any great distance posed a serious risk, but the alternative, leaving it behind, simply wasn't an option. At first, the horse balked at the sight of the open trailer door. Its eyes rolled with a primal anxiety, the memory of earlier neglect or mistreatment still fresh in its addled mind. Daniel whispered words of encouragement, stroking its neck to calm the trembling in its legs. Reaching into a worn canvas bag, he produced a handful of oats and allowed the horse to sniff the grains. The horse's nostrils flared, and though it was weak, hunger still gnawed at its insides. Slowly, step by uncertain step, it moved forward, motivated by both the gentle guidance and the meager offering of food. Once the horse set one hoof on the ramp, Daniel seized the moment. He coaxed, pleaded softly, and shifted his body to provide just enough pressure from behind to encourage the animal into the trailer. Each movement felt fraught with risk. The horse was exhausted, limbs shaky. If it stumbled, the outcome could be disastrous, both for the horse and for Daniel. But at last, with a final flick of its tail, the horse entered the trailer. Daniel quickly and carefully secured it, providing support with improvised padding he'd brought along, sheets, towels, and even some spare hay to brace the horse's emaciated body. "Easy," Daniel breathed, stepping back to admire his work. The thoroughbred's eyes reflected exhaustion and a flicker of trust, a silent acceptance that, for better or worse, its fate lay in Daniel's hands now. The old breeder felt his chest tighten with an emotion he thought he had sealed away forever. His vow to avoid heartbreak rang hollow in the face of the horse's suffering. He had once promised himself he would never watch another horse fade away if he could prevent it. With a last glance at the swirling desert horizon, still not quite settled after the storm, Daniel climbed into the driver's seat. He turned the ignition, and the truck rumbled to life, rattling and shaking as it began the long journey back to his ranch. The drive would take hours, but he had no intention of speeding. Every bump threatened the horse's fragile balance, and Daniel didn't want to compound its trauma. His ranch, tucked away near a shallow river that occasionally brought fresh water to the otherwise arid region, was once a place of sanctuary. Over the years, it had housed dozens of recovered racehorses and rescued animals, providing them with the second chance they so desperately needed. After Daniel's personal tragedy, though, most of the stables had been left empty, a forlorn testament to broken dreams. Yet as the truck bounced along the rutted road, he couldn't shake the sense that maybe this horse, this unnamed, half-dead thoroughbred, might just prove that no vow is absolute, and that redemption could still be found under a punishing sun. The sun was sinking behind the distant dunes, setting the sky ablaze in a collage of oranges, pinks, and deep purples by the time Daniel finally pulled up to the ranch. The property spread out around a single-story house with peeling paint and a weather-beaten barn that had seen far better days. Years ago, the place had thrummed with activity, from farriers making regular visits to stable hands hustling to care for the animals. Laughter, whinnies, and the comforting aroma of hay had once been constants in Daniel's life. But ever since he'd downsized, the ranch felt hushed, almost haunted by the memories of what used to be. Stepping out, he inhaled the faint scent of juniper carried by the evening breeze. His moment of reflection was cut short by the weak sound of the horse shifting in the trailer. Hurriedly, Daniel moved to lower the ramp and peer inside. The thoroughbred's eyes were half-lidded, the exhaustion of the journey evident in the way its head hung low. Still, it was alive, and that fact alone spurred Daniel into motion. Carefully, he guided the horse down the ramp. Each step was a small victory. The desert had tried to claim this creature, and any misstep might still push it over the edge. But for the moment, survival held. The overhead lights around the barn glowed softly, illuminating the horse's dull coat. Daniel led it to the largest stall, which he'd hastily prepared with clean straw and a few flakes of the best hay he had left. The thoroughbred staggered a bit, leaning into Daniel's shoulder as if acknowledging it needed help. Daniel's heart twisted at that gesture of reliance. "Easy now," he whispered, guiding the horse inside. After unfastening the makeshift rope halter, he gave the horse a chance to stand freely. It didn't collapse, which was a relief, though it swayed from pure fatigue. For several seconds, Daniel simply watched, his mind awash with memories of horses he'd saved in the past and the ones he hadn't been able to rescue. The flickering barn light cast shifting shadows over the thoroughbred's body, illuminating every scar, every protruding rib, every hint of the cruelty it had endured. He felt both anger and sadness stirring in his chest. Somewhere out there, someone had allowed this to happen. Some stable, some owner, had made a choice to abandon a once proud animal to a slow death. That thought clenched Daniel's jaw, reigniting a fierce protective streak he had once believed lost. He pushed back the swirl of emotion. There would be time for answers later. Right now, the only thing that mattered was stabilizing the horse. He retrieved a water bucket and slowly lifted it to the horse's muzzle. This time, the animal drank more confidently, almost greedily. Daniel allowed a small smile, though worry shadowed his face. For all its will to live, the horse was precariously close to the edge. Night descended like a heavy curtain, bringing an eerie stillness to the ranch. With the horse secure in the stall, Daniel made a quick phone call to the only veterinarian he trusted, a doctor named Leah Merrick. She was a no-nonsense woman who had been practicing in the region for over a decade, known for her expertise in large animal medicine and her compassion for creatures in dire straits. Although Daniel had pulled away from most social connections after his personal tragedy, Leah remained one of the few people he could count on, if only for professional reasons. He left a brief message describing the horse's condition and its precarious state, then sank into a worn chair by the barn's entrance. He kept the stall door in his line of sight, unwilling to leave the thoroughbred unattended. The hours dragged, the desert night cooled to a tolerable level, and stars unveiled themselves across a sky unpolluted by city lights. At times, the horse stirred, letting out a labored exhale or stamping a hoof feebly against the straw. Daniel checked on it every 15 minutes or so, offering sips of water or a gentle pat on the neck. In that hush, the bond between them began to form, though Daniel tried to resist the idea of becoming attached. Just as the clock neared midnight, a pair of headlights cut through the darkness. Leah's pickup rolled to a stop, and she hopped out with her medical kit in hand. The hush of the night swallowed her footsteps until she reached the open barn door. "Daniel," she said by way of greeting, her tone brisk but tinged with concern. Even in the dim light, she carried herself with the assured air of someone who had faced hundreds of emergencies. She stepped into the stall without hesitation, running experienced hands over the horse's bony frame. The thoroughbred pinned its ears briefly but remained still, too drained to offer resistance. Leah checked vitals, heart rate, temperature, respiratory effort, and her frown deepened with each new assessment. Daniel hung back, arms folded, a knot twisting in his stomach as he watched the vet's expression. "This poor thing," Leah said finally, straightening up, "severely dehydrated, severely malnourished. I don't know how it's still on its feet." She retrieved an IV line from her kit, preparing to administer fluids. "Get me a clean bucket of water and a few clean towels," she instructed, not looking away from the horse. Daniel obeyed immediately, feeling a pang of relief that someone more qualified had stepped into the situation. As Leah began cleaning the horse's wounds, scattered patches of raw flesh that were magnets for insects, she pursed her lips. "I'll do what I can, Daniel, but this is going to be a battle." Her eyes flicked up toward him, reflecting caution but also the spark of determination. "If we catch any infection that's set in, if we stabilize his system with fluids and nutrition, there's a chance, but you need to be ready for a long haul." Daniel simply nodded, his gaze drifting to the horse, which now trembled under Leah's ministrations. He'd been through this sort of ordeal countless times in the past, but it never got easier. Still, a flicker of the old Daniel Carter flared within him, the man who refused to give up on a horse simply because the odds seemed stacked high. By the time Leah finished administering the IV fluids and bandaging the worst of the horse's injuries, the moon had climbed high overhead, bathing the barn in an otherworldly glow. The single overhead light bulb buzzed intermittently, throwing wavering shadows across the straw-covered floor. Leah dusted off her hands and turned to Daniel, her face pale but resolute. "This horse has a will to live," she said, nodding toward the stall where the animal now rested, breathing more steadily than before. "But it's critical we keep a close eye for any signs of infection or organ failure. Its system is running on fumes." She began packing up her gear, glancing at Daniel over her shoulder. I'll come by again tomorrow with more supplies. In the meantime, try to keep him calm, keep him hydrated, and if he shows signs of fever or distress, call me. Daniel walked her to the barn door, the night air cool against his dust-streaked skin. The murmur of crickets played in the darkness, a lullaby that contrasted with the day's harsh trials. He cleared his throat. Thanks, Leah. I owe you. She shook her head. You owe me nothing. I just wish more people had your heart. There was a moment of unspoken understanding between them, a shared history of seeing countless horses suffer under neglect and abuse. But Daniel also sensed a question in Leah's gaze. Why, after all his heartbreak, was he diving headfirst into this again? Daniel wasn't sure he had an answer that would satisfy either of them. After Leah's pickup disappeared down the dirt road, Daniel returned to the stall. Leaning against the wooden partition, he scrutinized the thoroughbred's every breath. The horse's eyes fluttered open briefly, taking in the sight of Daniel with an expression that hovered between confusion and relief. Carefully, Daniel reached out and patted the animal's shoulder. His gaze caught on something beneath the layered grime, what looked like a faint scar. It wasn't unusual for a horse to have a few marks, but this one, long and straight, seemed too deliberate to be from an accident. Without thinking, he brushed away some of the caked dirt. That's when he felt it, a raised, branded patch of skin, partially obscured by dried blood and matted hair. As he cleared more away, his stomach tightened. The brand was partially recognizable, enough that a wave of shock washed over him. He ran his fingertips along the outline, a jolt of realization hitting him like a lightning strike. This wasn't just a random, neglected horse. His heart thudded in his chest as he recalled the name that brand signified. He'd heard it whispered in racing circles, connected to a thoroughbred with extraordinary lineage and an impressive winning streak. Moonrunner. But Moonrunner had vanished months ago under suspicious circumstances. How on earth had this prize champion ended up here, on the verge of death, abandoned in the desert? The answers would not be simple or comforting. Daniel's breath caught in his throat, and for a fleeting moment, he considered the scale of what he'd stepped into. Holding his hand gently against the horse's neck, he whispered, "What did they do to you, boy?" Dawn broke over the ranch in delicate hues of pink and gold, but Daniel was too restless to appreciate the beauty of the sky. He hadn't slept for more than a few minutes at a time, his mind whirring with questions about how Moonrunner, a legendary thoroughbred with a glittering race record, had come to be so brutally discarded. He poured himself a cup of coffee that had long since gone cold, sipping it absently as he mulled over the horse's discovered brand. While the world of competitive racing had its share of dark corners, this felt more sinister than a mere case of neglect. Leah arrived just as the sun was climbing higher, turning the horizon into a brilliant fire. She examined Moonrunner methodically, checking the horse's vitals and making careful notes in a little spiral-bound notebook. Daniel hovered outside the stall, arms folded, fighting the impulse to pace. He'd already begun to scour old racing databases, phoning acquaintances who might have heard rumors about Moonrunner's disappearance. All he'd learned was that people had assumed the stallion was stolen, perhaps whisked away by some unscrupulous trainer or illegal breeder. Few had dared to question it openly. Big money owners often had the power to silence inconvenient truths. "He's holding steady," Leah said, drawing Daniel out of his thoughts. Her voice was calm but tinged with caution. "No fever, and he's taking fluids. It's a good sign, but we're not out of the woods." She gave the horse a gentle pat on the flank, then turned to Daniel. "I can come back later this evening. Keep offering small amounts of feed. Watch for any sign of infection. If he's as valuable as I suspect, someone might come looking for him eventually." Daniel grimaced. "That's what I'm afraid of," he admitted, glancing over at Moonrunner's stall. "If the owner found out I have him—" He trailed off, unwilling to voice his concerns fully. How often had he heard about shady deals in the racing world, owners who arranged accidents to rid themselves of horse that no longer paid off? It was unthinkable, yet it happened more often than most people knew. Leah seemed to read his mind. "Daniel," she said softly, "if someone intentionally got rid of him, they're not going to be happy he survived. You need to be careful, both for his sake and yours." She tapped her notebook thoughtfully. I could contact a colleague at an equine rescue in another state. They specialize in rehabilitating abused racehorses. They might have the resources to hide him and until he's stable enough to travel. A flicker of defiance stirred in Daniel's chest. The idea of spiriting Moonrunner away, out of sight, felt like admitting defeat. He had only just begun to fight for this horse's life, and now he was supposed to let someone else take over? But then he recalled the half-dead creature in the desert and the ruthless nature of those who likely wanted the thoroughbred gone. His jaw tightened. "I'll think about it," he said at last, though his resolve was still wavering between pride and pragmatism. A few hours after Leah departed, Daniel decided he couldn't just sit and wait for trouble to find him. He needed more information. Specifically, he had to confirm beyond a doubt that the horse in his barn was indeed Moonrunner. He also needed some hint as to why the stallion had been discarded with such cruelty. So he pulled out his old phone directory, flipping through well-worn pages filled with numbers of trainers, stable managers, and fellow breeders he'd once known intimately. He stopped at the name Mark Reyes, an old friend from his days on the racing circuit. Mark had a reputation for sniffing out hidden truths, partly because he'd worked as a stable hand at some of the most prominent tracks in the country. If rumors were swirling about Moonrunner's disappearance, Mark would know something. Daniel punched in the number and waited, anxiety swirling in his gut. The phone rang several times before a gravelly voice answered, sounding both surprised and wary. "Daniel Carter? Well, I'll be damned. I thought you'd fallen off the face of the earth," Mark said by way of greeting. Daniel could practically see the man adjusting his cap and leaning against the stable door, a half smile on his weathered face. "Close to it," Daniel replied, forcing a lightness he didn't entirely feel. He hesitated for a breath. "Listen, I need some intel. It's about Moonrunner." A pause on the other end. "Moonrunner? That horse vanished months ago. Word was some criminals stole him for either breeding or ransom. Big talk for a while, then it died down." Mark's tone turned cautious. "Why are you asking?" Daniel weighed his next words carefully. "Let's just say, I've come across a horse that looks a lot like him. Same brand, same build, though he's in rough shape." He sighed, deciding to trust Mark. "It's definitely him, Mark. Someone dumped him to die out here in the desert." "Good God," Mark breathed, clearly rattled by the news. "That means Clifton Holdings must be behind it." Daniel's brow creased. "Clifton Holdings?" "Yeah," Mark confirmed with a soft grunt. "That's the investment group that actually owned Moonrunner. But let's be real, Clifton Holdings is just a fancy name. Everyone knows the real boss is Arthur Langford. He's got deep pockets, Daniel, real deep. If he finds out you have the horse—" Daniel swallowed, his mind flashing to Moonrunner's emaciated body and the memory of how close he'd been to death in the storm. "Then I have more reason to keep him safe," he finished, pressing a hand to his forehead. "Listen, if you find out anything else, like why Langford would ditch a champion horse, call me. And Mark," he paused, voice low, "please keep this quiet." Mark agreed, his tone grave as he promised to dig around. After the call ended, Daniel flipped his phone shut and let out a slow breath. So, Arthur Langford, a name he knew only by reputation, was behind Clifton Holdings. The question was, how far would a man like that go to keep dark secrets buried? The tension at the ranch grew thicker with each passing day. Daniel barely left the horse's side, administering pain relief and antibiotics according to Leah's schedule. He also started the painstaking process of cleaning and dressing the open wounds that peppered Moonrunner's flanks. The stallion was too weak to protest much, but the look in his eyes spoke volumes, an odd mixture of acceptance and deep-seated fear. As Moonrunner's strength gradually improved, Daniel began to notice subtle changes. The horse no longer teetered on the brink of collapse every time he stood. His eyes, once glazed over with exhaustion, started to show glimmers of awareness. Daniel found himself talking to Moonrunner more than he ever expected, recounting old stories of past rescues and the heartbreak he'd endured losing his favorite stallion. Though the horse couldn't understand every word, the soft murmur of a human voice seemed to soothe him. One evening, after a long day of tending to the horse, Daniel stepped outside the barn to catch a breath of fresh air. Twilight had settled over the ranch, painting the sky in muted blues and purples. He leaned against the fence, glancing toward the dirt road that led away from his property. Anxiety twisted in his chest, and he couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching. He recalled Mark's warning. If Arthur Langford found out where Moonrunner was, trouble would follow. Daniel pressed his lips into a tight line, recalling all the stories he'd heard over the years, how Langford would stop at nothing to protect his investments or eliminate liabilities. Most people in the racing circuit praised him publicly, but behind closed doors, rumors abounded of threats, bribery, and worse. With a sigh, Daniel pushed off the fence and went back to check on Moonrunner. He found the stallion awake, shifting restlessly in the stall. The horse's ragged breathing was less pronounced, a small but crucial improvement. "Hey boy," Daniel murmured, stroking the sleek spot between the horse's eyes. "You're going to pull through, I can feel it." The words felt like both a promise and a plea. Deep down, Daniel knew that saving Moonrunner was about more than just one horse. It was a chance at redemption for himself. He had walked away from a life of rescuing horses because the heartbreak had nearly destroyed him. Yet here he was, on the brink of risking everything for a thoroughbred that powerful men apparently wanted gone. Sometimes the line between courage and folly was razor thin, but if there was one thing Daniel couldn't ignore, it was a horse that still had the will to fight. A few nights later, as Daniel dozed in a chair by the barn door, unwilling to stray too far, his phone buzzed loudly against a wooden table. He jolted awake, the glow from a single overhead bulb making him squint. Fumbling, he grabbed the phone. "Yeah," he mumbled, voice thick from half-sleep. "Daniel, it's Mark. I've got news," came the hushed reply. Something in Mark's tone immediately sent adrenaline coursing through Daniel's veins. "Go ahead," Daniel said, forcing himself fully awake. He pushed off the chair and stood, pacing in small circles near the barn entrance. "I made some calls," Mark said, voice now trembling with urgency. "Langford's been telling people he took care of the problem. That's the phrase he used. Word around a couple of stables is that Moonrunner wasn't performing as expected in private training sessions. They thought the horse might be permanently injured. If that got out, the stallion's breeding value would plummet, and so would Langford's profits." Daniel's free hand balled into a fist. The idea of a horse being cast aside merely because it wasn't yielding top returns struck a raw nerve. He was no stranger to the cruelty some owners displayed, but this was on another level. "So, Langford dumped him to die?" Daniel spat the words in disgust. "That's low, even by racing industry standards." Mark sighed. "That's the story. Langford probably figured if there was no proof the horse had a career-ending injury, he could still spin his own narrative and claim insurance or keep the rumor mill at bay. But if it comes out that Moonrunner is alive and in terrible shape, Langford could face lawsuits, maybe even criminal charges. He won't let that happen without a fight." A heavy silence settled between them. Daniel closed his eyes, trying to keep his voice steady. "Thanks for telling me, Mark. I owe you." "Just watch your back, Danny," Mark said softly. "Langford's not a man you want to cross. He's made people disappear before. People and animals. You keep that horse hidden, you hear me?" After the call ended, Daniel leaned against the barn's wooden frame, an uneasy knot coiled in his stomach. So it was true. Moonrunner had been discarded like useless junk because of a suspected injury. Now Daniel had evidence that could ruin Langford if the real story got out. He glanced into the stall. The horse was calm for once, eyes half closed as he rested. A wave of protectiveness washed over Daniel. He didn't want a war. But if Langford discovered Moonrunner's location, Daniel would be forced to stand his ground. He couldn't just turn the horse over to a man who saw him as nothing more than damaged merchandise. "I won't let anyone hurt you again," Daniel muttered, as though making a vow to himself as well as to the stallion. The barn felt both like a sanctuary and a potential battleground, a place where salvation and danger now walked hand in hand. By the following morning, Daniel realized he needed a plan that went beyond simply keeping the horse out of sight. He remembered Leah's suggestion about contacting a specialized equine rescue in another state. The more he considered it, the more it seemed like the only viable way to protect Moonrunner long-term. But part of him recoiled at the idea of letting the horse go. Standing in the barn aisle, Daniel watched Moonrunner gingerly munch on a small portion of hay. The horse's coat had begun to lose some of its dullness, and a measure of spirit now shone in his eyes. If left alone, Moonrunner might well have a chance to recover fully. but only if Langford and his hired hands never found him. Daniel paced, sorting through thoughts like a stack of shifting puzzle pieces. He could try to keep Moonrunner in hiding at his ranch, but that meant constant vigilance. He didn't have the funds to hire round-the-clock security, nor did he want to involve local law enforcement, considering the influence Langford's wealth could buy. Finally, he pulled out his phone and dialed Leah. She answered on the second ring. "Leah, I need the number of that out-of-state rescue you mentioned," Daniel said without preamble, raking a hand through his hair. He heard her cautious exhale on the other end. "So you're thinking about moving him?" she asked, not unkindly. Daniel cast a glance at the stall. "I don't see another way, not if I want to keep him alive." A pause, then Leah's voice took on a brisk efficiency. "All right, the place is called Bridger's Hope Equine Sanctuary. It's run by a friend of mine, Susan. She's worked with severely abused and injured racehorses before. They have a network that can relocate horses discreetly, especially when there are legal threats involved." He scribbled down the information on the back of a feed receipt. "Thank you," he murmured. "Leah, I'm not giving up on him. I'm just—" "You're ensuring his survival," she finished for him gently. "I understand, Daniel. Sometimes saving a life means letting go." The words stung with truth. Daniel swallowed hard, unable to conjure a reply that felt worthy of the moment. After a few more details exchanged, they ended the call. He remained there in the barn's echoing silence, the phone still clutched in his hand. Letting Moonrunner go could be the best shot at real safety, yet every fiber of his being wanted to stand and fight. In the end, he told himself the same thing he told every frightened horse he'd ever rehabilitated. Sometimes retreat isn't surrender, it's survival. That same afternoon, Daniel tried to keep his mind off the decision he'd just made by focusing on chores around the ranch, stacking hay bales, repairing loose boards in the barn walls, checking the perimeter fences. It all offered a temporary reprieve from the mental treadmill of doubts and fears. But the work only made him more aware of how empty the place had become. Where once a dozen horses roamed, now only a handful of stalls were even usable. It was as though the ranch itself had gone into mourning after the death of Daniel's beloved stallion. He was in the middle of hammering a stubborn nail into a fence post when he heard the distant rumble of a vehicle. His heart skipped. Cautiously, he laid down the hammer and peered toward the entrance road. A black SUV was approaching, its sleek exterior glinting ominously under the midday sun. Every alarm in Daniel's body went off. He glanced at the barn, where Moonrunner was dozing in relative peace, and felt a rush of protective urgency. The SUV rolled to a stop near the ranch house, and two men in neatly pressed suits stepped out. One was tall, with dark hair slicked back, and an air of practiced confidence. The other was bulkier, his stance radiating a latent threat. They surveyed the property briefly, then made a beeline for Daniel, who stood near the fence with the arms crossed to hide his unease. "Mr. Carter?" the tall man asked, voice smooth as glass. "Maybe," Daniel replied, gaze flitting between the two strangers. "Who's asking?" A flicker of a smile curved the tall man's lips, but it held no warmth. "We represent Mr. Arthur Langford. I believe you have something that belongs to him." Daniel's stomach twisted, so Langford had caught wind of Moonrunner's whereabouts. He kept his expression neutral, though the adrenaline in his veins spiked. "Not sure what you mean," he lied casually, glancing around as if perplexed by their presence. The bulkier man took a half step forward. "We're not here to play games," he said, voice low. "Merce Langford is offering a simple exchange. You hand over the horse, no questions asked, and you can get back to your quiet life. Otherwise—" He didn't finish the sentence, but the implication rang clear in the heavy desert air. Daniel's jaw tightened. For a fleeting moment, the memory of Moonrunner's gaunt frame, half buried by swirling sand, flashed through his mind. He thought of the horse's terrified eyes and battered body. No, he couldn't just turn him over to men who saw him as a discardable commodity. "I don't know what you're talking about," Daniel repeated, pressing the fence post with one hand to steady his shaking. The tall man's gaze hardened. "We have reliable information that you're harboring Langford's property. Our employer prefers this be handled quietly, but we can escalate if necessary." Daniel felt his pulse pounding in his temples. He forced himself to stand taller, to appear unruffled. "If you have a warrant or any legal document, I'd be happy to read it," he said, voice deliberately calm. "Otherwise, I'd suggest you leave my property." For a tense moment, neither side moved. The men from the SUV exchanged a glance, and Daniel could practically hear the mental calculations happening behind their impassive faces. Was a show of force the best option? Was Daniel bluffing about not having the horse? Finally, the taller man exhaled sharply, as if disappointed. "Fine, we'll go," he said. "But know this, Mr. Langford does not appreciate falsehoods. If you're lying, we'll be back." With that, they returned to their SUV. Daniel watched, arms still crossed, as the vehicle kicked up a plume of dust on the way out. Only once they were out of sight did he let out a trembling breath and press a hand to his forehead. That had been close. Too close. Hurriedly, he rushed back into the barn. Moonrunner stood in his stall, eyes wide, as though sensing the danger in the air. The horse flicked his ears forward and back, a clear sign of agitation. Daniel stroked the stallion's forehead, softening his voice to a whisper. "It's okay, boy. We'll figure this out." But would they? Daniel thought of calling the police. But what good would that do against a man as influential as Arthur Langford? Money had a way of speaking louder than ethics. And if these men returned, they might do more than just issue threats. Daniel glanced around the barn as though half expecting more intruders to appear. No, he had to act before they made good on their warning. He pulled out his phone and quickly dialed the number Leah had given him for Bridger's Hope Equine Sanctuary. After a few rings, a warm, authoritative female voice answered, introducing herself as Susan. Daniel explained the situation in clipped phrases. The horse was in critical care, valuable, and his life was at risk. Could she help relocate him somewhere safe? Susan didn't hesitate. "We've handled situations like this before, Daniel," she said, her tone reassuring. "We have a secure location where we can keep horses that are in the middle of a legal dispute or threatened by former owners. It's going to take some planning, and we'll need a vet's clearance to travel, but we can do it." As relief bubbled inside him, Daniel offered a terse nod, even though she couldn't see him. "Thank you," he managed. "We're on a tight clock. These men, Langford's men, already showed up here. They'll be back." "We can dispatch a transport team with an enclosed trailer," Susan said. "They're experienced with rescues and can load him as quietly as possible. Keep him safe until then." Hanging up, Daniel leaned against the barn wall. Every nerve in his body felt electrified with tension. Even as the sun moved across the sky, casting shifting beams of light into the barn, he couldn't shake the sense that this rescue had turned into a race against time, one he was determined not to lose. The following evening, Daniel stood in the barn's open doorway, breathing in the cool twilight air and trying to steady his nerves. Moonrunner's quiet shuffling reached him from inside the stall, a reminder that the horse was still healing, still relying on Daniel's every decision. Earlier that day, Susan had confirmed her team could come in 2 nights' time, under the cover of darkness, to discreetly transport the stallion to Bridger's Hope Equine Sanctuary. The plan was set. The truck, an enclosed trailer, would navigate a back road leading to Daniel's ranch, load Moonrunner swiftly, and leave before Langford's men had any chance to interfere. A soft nicker drifted through the air, and Daniel turned to find the horse peering at him over the stall door. Though Moonrunner remained painfully thin, his coat had begun to reclaim a subtle sheen. With adequate rest, careful feeding, and daily wound care, the bruises and open sores that once marred his body were slowly mending. The improvement in his posture was visible, no longer perpetually hunched as if expecting a blow. Sometimes, while stroking the stallion's neck, Daniel allowed himself to dream that maybe, with enough time and love, the horse might gallop again. He pushed away that hopeful thought with a quiet sigh. Even if Moonrunner recovered fully, staying here was out of the question. Langford's reach was too extensive, his resources too vast. The memory of those 2 suited men, standing by their black SUV and demanding the horse's surrender, still sent a chill through Daniel's spine. If he dared to wait much longer, there was no telling what tactics they might use. For a moment, Daniel allowed himself to revisit the past, recalling the times he'd given shelter to injured racehorses. He'd once believed that by saving each horse, he was making a dent in the exploitation rampant in the racing industry. But after the devastating loss of his own cherished stallion, he had let bitterness take root. He'd declared he was done, finished. until he found Moonrunner dying in the desert. Now, every day felt like a second chance, not just for the horse, but for Daniel's battered sense of purpose. Outside, crickets began their evening chorus, and a warm breeze rustled the sparse desert vegetation. Daniel closed his eyes, imagining the truck from Bridger's Hope pulling in, imaginarily hearing the soft shuffle of hooves as they loaded Moonrunner onto a safe trailer. He tried to picture the stallion stepping onto a lush paddock in a distant state, safe from the men who deemed him a disposable commodity. That image steadied his heart. He opened his eyes to find Moonrunner still gazing at him, ears pricked forward. Daniel let a small smile tug at his lips. 2 more days, he murmured, stepping into the barn. Just hang on a bit longer, boy. He had no illusions about the risks. People like Langford didn't tolerate loose ends. Still, Daniel felt a surge of determination. If fate had brought this horse to him, then he would fulfill his duty, whatever the cost. Daniel awoke the next morning to an unnerving sight. Tire tracks leading up to his ranch gate. Tracks that hadn't been there the day before. They didn't come all the way up the driveway, which meant someone had stopped, watched, and then left. Unease skittered down his spine as he crouched to inspect them. They were large enough to suggest an SUV or a pickup, and he had a strong suspicion it wasn't a friendly neighbor. Determined not to be caught off guard again, Daniel decided to prepare. He spent an hour methodically checking the ranch's perimeter, ensuring the gates could be locked if necessary. Then he went inside and rummaged through his dusty garage until he found what he was looking for. An old shotgun, not fired in years. He doubted he'd need to use it, but the mere presence of a deterrent might discourage any strong-arm tactics. Leah arrived midday, bringing fresh medical supplies. "You look tense," she observed, setting down her vet bag. "Something happened?" Daniel nodded grimly, showing her pictures he'd taken of the suspicious tire tracks. "They're keeping an eye on me, probably waiting for a moment when I'm off guard." He rubbed the back of his neck, trying to ease the knot of anxiety lodged there. "I'm getting Moonrunner out of here tomorrow night. That's the soonest Susan's team can come." Leah glanced toward the barn, worry etched in her features. "Is he strong enough for a long trip?" "Strong enough," Daniel replied. "We'll go slow. Susan said they have a vet tech who travels with them on transports like this. They'll keep him stable during the drive. It's his best shot." She exhaled, a mixture of relief and sadness crossing her face. "I know this isn't easy for you, letting him go, I mean." Daniel's gaze drifted to the stall. Moonrunner was standing near the door, ears swiveling as if drawn by the sound of their voices. The horse was curious but still cautious, an animal that had survived unimaginable neglect, yet somehow retained a spark of trust. "It's not," Daniel admitted quietly, "but it's not about me. I have no right to hang on to him just to ease my own conscience." Leah set a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "I'll help in any way I can. I can stay overnight, keep an eye out. If Langford's men try something, at least you won't be alone." Daniel gave her a grateful nod. He hadn't wanted to involve anyone else in this mess, but the truth was he could use the backup. "Thank you," he said, meaning it. Then, trying to lighten the mood, he added, "I've got an old cot you can set up in the barn, if you don't mind the smell of hay and horse." She managed a small laugh. "I've slept in worse places, believe me." Together they walked back to the barn, each step resonating with a blend of trepidation and hope. For all the grim possibilities hanging over their heads, there was a sense that the end game was near, and with it, perhaps, a chance for true salvation for both the horse and the man who had saved him. Night fell with a startling swiftness, shadows stretching across the ranch like silent sentinels. Daniel double-checked every stall latch, every window, and every door, determined to keep Moonrunner protected until the rescue team arrived. Leah settled onto the cot near the stall, while Daniel stationed himself near the barn entrance. The rhythmic chirping of crickets formed a lullaby for the anxious hours that ticked by. But no calm ever lasted long under such tension. Around midnight, Leah dozed off, and Daniel finally let his eyelids drift shut. He was somewhere between waking and sleep when he heard it. A distant growl of an engine, low and menacing in the still air. Every muscle in Daniel's body snapped to attention as he grabbed a flashlight and edged outside. The faint headlights he spotted beyond the ranch gate confirmed his worst fears. Another vehicle had arrived, and it wasn't Susan's rescue team. He ducked back into the barn. Leah, he hissed, shaking her shoulder. She startled awake instantly. We've got company, he murmured, glancing toward Moonrunner. The stallion snorted, sensing the sudden tension. Leah got to her feet, eyes wide. They're out there, she whispered. Daniel nodded, picking up the old shotgun he'd retrieved earlier. I'm not looking for a fight, but I won't let them waltz in here and take him. Together they hovered by the barn door, peering out. The vehicle's headlights cut off, plunging the yard into darkness. A few seconds later, Daniel heard the crunch of boots on gravel. His heart hammered against his ribs. He flipped his flashlight on, shining it toward the sound. Two figures came into view, the same suited men from before. You're trespassing, Daniel called out, trying to keep his voice steady. The beam of light revealed tense expressions. The taller man raised both hands as though in a placating gesture, while the broader one hovered at the periphery, face set in a scowl. We don't want trouble, said the tall man, though his tone implied the exact opposite. Mr. Langford just wants what's his. That horse doesn't belong to you, Mr. Carter. Daniel swallowed, stepping forward so they could see the shotgun in his grip. That horse was dumped in the desert, left for dead. If Langford wanted him, he shouldn't have tried to kill him. His voice trembled slightly, but righteous anger burned in his eyes. A tense silence loomed, broken only by the restless shuffle of Moonrunner inside. Leah stood behind Daniel, arms folded but ready to act if things turned violent. She caught Daniel's gaze for a heartbeat, a silent acknowledgement that they were in this together, no matter what. The taller man's jaw clenched. We don't need your sermons. Hand him over, or we'll do this the hard way. Daniel raised the shotgun a fraction. Not tonight, not ever, he said, hoping fervently that his words wouldn't be his last. At that, the mood shifted like a sudden drop in atmospheric pressure. The broader man curled his lip, taking a threatening step forward. Daniel's grip tightened on the shotgun, and Leah positioned herself so that she partially blocked the view of the stall. Inside, Moonrunner let out a low whinny, the tension in the barn unmistakable. I'm not going to repeat myself, Daniel warned, though his heart thudded painfully. He'd never pointed a gun at anyone in his life, let alone pulled a trigger. Still, desperation and protectiveness surged within him. The taller man narrowed his eyes, weighing the risk. This is foolish, he said, but his voice wavered slightly. You really want to throw your life away for some broken-down animal? Daniel's anger spiked at that callous description of Moonrunner. He set his jaw, the flashlight beam trembling on the men's suits. He's worth more than you'll ever understand, he growled. Now back off. For a moment, it seemed they might push further, test Daniel's resolve, maybe call his bluff. But the quiet confidence in his stance seemed to give them pause. The taller man exchanged a final glare with Daniel, then jerked his head at his partner. With a soft curse, they both retreated into the darkness. A car door slammed, the engine roared to life, and the headlights flashed on again. Gravel spat from under the tires as the vehicle peeled away. Daniel exhaled a shaky breath, lowering the shotgun. Every muscle in his body felt like it had been twisted into knots. Leah let out a sound that was half laugh, half sob, and placed a trembling hand over her mouth. The barn fell silent except for the quickened breathing of all present. You okay? Daniel asked, turning to Leah. His own voice was hoarse, adrenaline still coursing through him. She nodded, swallowing hard. I think so, but they'll be back, won't they? Daniel pressed his lips together. I'd bet on it. That was just another warning. He cast a worried glance at Moonrunner, who was breathing rapidly, nostrils flaring in alarm. Daniel stepped into the stall, stroking the horse's neck until the stallion quieted. Easy, boy, he murmured, his own heart still pounding. They spent the remainder of the night on high alert, weapons within reach, neither able to relax enough to sleep. Outside, the desert wind howled occasionally, an uneasy backdrop to the knowledge that danger still loomed close by. Daniel wondered if he'd have the strength to stand up to them again, or if the next time Langford's men would come in greater numbers, armed with more than just intimidation. By dawn, exhaustion weighed on them both, but the standoff had strengthened Daniel's conviction. Langford could threaten, bribe, or bully all he wanted, but as long as the horse remained on Daniel's property, he would fight to protect him. And when Susan's team finally arrived, Moonrunner would be free, safe from a world that had tried so hard to break him. The following day slid past in a haze of tension and exhaustion. Leah managed to steal a few hours of sleep on the cot, while Daniel busied himself with chores he normally overlooked, tightening bolts on stall doors, reinforcing locks, and double-checking the perimeter fence. Though his mind churned with anxiety about another unannounced visit, he felt a glimmer of hope. Tonight was the night Susan's team would arrive. If all went to plan, by sunrise, Moonrunner would be en route to a new life. Late in the afternoon, Leah did a final health check on the horse, making sure his condition was stable enough for travel. "He's still underweight and weak," she told Daniel, "but he's mobile, and his vitals are steady." She gave the stallion a fond pat on the neck. "He's tougher than he looks. That might just save his life." Daniel dipped his head in gratitude. "You've saved him as much as I have," he said quietly. "Without your help, who knows if he would have pulled through." A small smile touched Leah's lips, though her eyes remained troubled. "I only wish I could do more to stop Langford, but horses like Moonrunner slip through the cracks far too often in this business." Daniel understood all too well. He'd spent years confronting the ugly underbelly of the racing world: drugs, forced retirements, and deliberate neglect. It was what had driven him to rescue horses in the first place. Yet no matter how many he saved, it seemed there were always more in peril. "One horse at a time," he said, offering a half-hearted shrug. "It's all we can do." As dusk approached, he felt a fresh wave of nerves. Leah stepped outside to scan the horizon every 20 minutes, eyes peeled for signs of headlights. Neither of them knew exactly what kind of trailer Susan's team would be bringing, only that it would be discreet. Meanwhile, Daniel stayed in the barn with Moonrunner, hand resting comfortingly on the stallion's withers as the sky slowly shifted into a canvas of bruised purples and pinks. He tried not to think about the possibility that Langford's men might reappear at any moment, armed with more than just threats. If they arrived before Susan's team, would Daniel be able to drive them off again? A cold sweat beaded on his brow as he remembered last night's confrontation. He had stood his ground once. Could he do it again, especially if they escalated? Shaking off the worst-case scenarios, Daniel tightened the horse's halter, preparing for a swift departure. He could almost feel the tension thrumming through Moonrunner's frame, as though the horse sensed that another major trial lay just ahead. An hour past midnight, the rattling hum of an approaching vehicle finally broke the desert silence. This time, Daniel and Leah moved toward the barn's entrance with wary optimism, praying it was Susan's team rather than another unwelcome intrusion. The headlights were dim and the engine noise subdued, nothing like the flashy roar of Langford's goons. Sure enough, a modest truck pulling a closed, nondescript horse trailer eased through the ranch gate. Two figures hopped out. One was a tall woman with a friendly but no-nonsense demeanor. The other, a younger man wearing a baseball cap. The woman approached first, extending a hand in greeting. "You must be Daniel. I'm Susan. This is Everett," she added, nodding toward her companion. Relief flooded Daniel's chest. "Thank you for coming," he breathed, offering a quick handshake. "We've been on edge, so I apologize if we're not the most gracious hosts." Susan gave a reassuring smile. "No need. We know the situation's tense. Let's focus on loading the horse safely and getting out of here." "Where is he?" "Right this way," Daniel said, leading them into the barn. Moonrunner perked up at the new arrivals, ears pricked forward. Susan's expression softened instantly as she observed the horse's thin frame and obvious scars. Without asking permission, she stepped in close, letting Moonrunner sniff her palm. "Hello there," she murmured, her tone gentle yet firm. "We're going to take good care of you." She turned to Daniel. "He's in rough shape, but I've seen worse. Our vet tech is ready to monitor him during transport. The trailer's padded and will go as slow as needed." Daniel nodded, grateful for her expertise. He motioned to Leah, who brought over some last-minute medical supplies, including a small dose of tranquilizer if the horse became too stressed. "We'll try to avoid using it, but it's there if he panics," Leah explained. Outside, Everett had pulled the trailer close to the barn entrance. Working swiftly but quietly, Daniel and Susan guided Moonrunner out of the stall, the horse's hooves clicking softly on the barn's concrete floor. The stallion resisted at first, nostrils flared. The memory of past trailers, likely associated with torment, made him skittish. But Daniel positioned himself at Moonrunner's flank, speaking in low, calming tones while Susan took the lead rope. One step, two steps. The horse's breathing quickened, and he balked at the ramp. Everett stepped in with a handful of oats, crinkling the bag gently to catch the stallion's attention. With Daniel's reassuring voice and Susan's firm but kind guidance, Moonrunner eventually placed a hoof on the trailer ramp. Then another. Slowly he was coaxed inside, his eyes rolling in faint panic, but never enough to bolt. Once the horse was fully aboard, Everett and Susan began securing him, checking the padding, making sure the environment was as stress-free as possible. Leah slipped Daniel the tranquilizer syringe just in case, though Daniel prayed they wouldn't need it. His heart pounded. They were nearly done. If they could just leave without an incident, everything would be okay. That was when the sound of an engine cut through the still night air, louder, more aggressive than Susan's truck. Daniel's stomach twisted in dread. Gravel crunched under swiftly rolling tires, and a harsh set of headlights flooded the area. Leah grabbed Daniel's arm, her face mirroring the shock he felt. Susan stepped back from the trailer, eyes darting toward the intruding vehicle. "Get him secured," she hissed to Everett, then turned to Daniel. "We don't have time to do this quietly." Daniel nodded, voice strangled. "I'll handle them. You finish loading." He snatched the shotgun from its hiding place, though he prayed he wouldn't have to use it. Leah stood beside him, trembling but resolute. Sure enough, the black SUV screeched to a halt. The two suited men spilled out, just as before. This time, a third individual emerged, older, imperious, with a cruel set to his mouth. Daniel had never met Arthur Langford in person, but he suspected that's who he was looking at. The man surveyed the scene with thinly veiled contempt, lips curling when his gaze landed on the horse trailer. "So," Langford said, his voice oddly calm, "this is how it's going to be. You think you can steal from me, Carter? Hide what's mine?" Daniel braced the shotgun against his shoulder, though he didn't raise the barrel. "I'm not stealing anything. You threw Moonrunner away." Langford's eyes narrowed. "That horse cost me millions. He was an investment, no longer viable. It's my right to decide his fate." His gaze flicked disdainfully toward the trailer. "Hand him over, or I'll call the authorities and report you for theft." A grim laugh escaped Daniel. "Report away," he shot back. "But you'll have to explain why your prized thoroughbred was left to starve in the desert." Langford's expression darkened. "Careful," he warned, stepping closer. "I can bury any evidence you think you have. It's your word against mine." One of the suited henchmen also moved forward, reaching inside his jacket. Daniel's grip tightened on the shotgun, heart hammering so loudly he thought it might burst. "Stop," Leah said sharply, stepping up beside Daniel. "No one wants bloodshed. Moonrunner is leaving. If you want to pursue legal avenues, go ahead. But I'd advise you think carefully about the media circus that'll erupt once this gets out." Susan quietly gave Everett a thumbs up. The engine of the truck rumbled as he started it, the trailer shifting slightly behind. Daniel exchanged a quick glance with Susan. They were almost set. But could they leave without a full confrontation? Langford's face twisted in anger, and for a horrifying second, Daniel thought he might order his men to seize the horse by force. Instead, the old magnate snorted, pointing a finger at Daniel. "You're making a grave mistake. This will come back to haunt you." "Maybe," Daniel allowed, swallowing hard, "but at least I'll be able to live with myself." The roar of the truck's engine grew as Susan pulled away, the trailer carrying Moonrunner safely in the rear. Leah and Daniel stood their ground, guns unwavering, blocking Langford's path until the trailer's taillights vanished into the darkness. Only when the SUV revved its own engine and turned around, spitting gravel in frustration, did Daniel finally lower the shotgun, hands shaking from the aftermath. An overwhelming sense of relief and sorrow washed over him. Moonrunner was gone, spirited away to a safer place, but Daniel felt hollow at the sudden emptiness. He had fulfilled his duty. Now he had to face a life forever changed by a horse that had been left to die, and found a second chance in the most desperate of circumstances. Looking back on the challenges they faced, from the harsh desert rescue to the tense midnight standoff, it's clear that every obstacle was a step toward a more hopeful ending. In the end, the horse found sanctuary in a place where cruelty no longer lurked around every corner, and our rescuer rediscovered a purpose he thought he had lost forever. Their story is a reminder that even when greed and power threaten the vulnerable, a determined few can make all the difference. Thank you for journeying with us through each twist and turn. If you found hope or inspiration in this tale, we'd love to hear your thoughts. Comment below to share your impressions, questions, or any similar stories you know. Together, we can keep the conversation going and continue shining a light on acts of kindness in our world.